Hey guys, John here from Sonic Drive Studio. Thanks so much for tuning back into the channel. I hope you're all doing good. I thought we'd have some fun, some gear nerd fun, and talk about my amps. All 33 of them. I recently released a video called One Song 33 Amps. And in that 6.5 hour long video, you can listen to all my amplifiers with clean, crunch, heavy rock, lead and boosted metal tones, both in a full mix and isolated. I know, it's a crazy long video. I mean, 6.5 hours is just nuts. It was a lot of work to put that together, but I'm super happy with the results. You can use the detailed timestamps or time codes in the description to skip around between all the amps, so that's a very convenient way of watching that 6.5 hour long video. So if you haven't seen that video yet, do check it out because it's pretty awesome. I say this jokingly, but it's basically the biggest amp demo in human history. It's a joke, but it's also true. Anyway, so I'm going to put a link in the description below, so go check that out if you want to hear all the amps in action. So in this video, I'm going to go over my entire amp collection and just talk about the amps. What I like about them, what I maybe dislike about them, what kind of tones they have to offer, what kind of styles they are suited for, whatever comes to mind basically. I'm going to go over the amps in the same order as the One Song 33 Amps video, which is basically a random order. So let's get started right away. So the first amplifier that we're going to talk about is my beloved and recently acquired Orange Rockefeller 50 Mark III, which is over here. This is one of the latest additions to my collection. It's a super wonderful amplifier that I've wanted for a long time, so I'm super stoked to finally have one. I already did a full review and demo of the amplifier on my channel, so if you're interested in a more detailed review and demo of the Orange Rockefeller 50 Mark III, definitely check out that demo as well. So it's a 50 watt 2-channel amplifier with EL34s in the power section. 50 watts is a lot of power, so it has a lot of juice. But the built-in attenuator is very handy for sort of dialing in the power amp saturation and doing that at decent levels, so without pissing off the neighbors or the entire neighborhood for that matter, because 50 watts is a lot of power, trust me. The clean tones on this amplifier are very nice. I really like the orange clean tones in general. They sound very good, in my opinion, very balanced. Plenty of mids, but also plenty of treble and bass. So overall a very balanced sound. And the built-in reverb is a very nice and musical sounding addition to this amplifier. So that's very cool as well. The clean channel only has a treble, bass and volume control, but that's plenty to get some great clean tones. And you can also push that channel up to a very nice sort of light overdrive. And the attenuator comes in very handy because it gets very loud once you crank that up. The dirty channel on this amplifier is just to die for. It's just the perfect orange tone. It does have that classic orange sizzle and that big low end and the big mids, and it does have that sort of orange fuzzy character, but it definitely has a good mid-range bark or push to it when you compare it to some of the other orange amps that I have, some of the smaller ones. So this amp is amazing for rock and metal and high gain stuff. It's also pretty good at crunch tones, but for clean and high gain it's just simply amazing. So it was built with a lot of love in the UK, so it's a very high quality amplifier both in sound and how it was built. So it's definitely one of the more expensive amps in my collection. A dream amp for sure. I'm super stoked to have one. Let's move on to the second amp, the Mesobugi or Boogie Mark 535. A very cool amplifier with a lot of tonal options. It's a 2-channel amp, but every channel has 3 modes, and there are also 3 wattage settings for each channel. So we've got 10 watts, 25 watts, and 35 watts. It's got a built-in graphical equalizer, which is of course very handy for dialing in that classic Mesobugi Mark sound. The clean channel is very nice and versatile. You've got some sparkly clean tones with the clean mode. You've got a bit of a fatter and bigger clean tone with the fat mode. And then we've got the crunch mode on that same channel. And the cool thing about that channel is that you can dial it in to have a nice crunch, like a British type crunch, but you can also dial it in like a high gain amplifier with a lot of gain. So that makes that channel very, very versatile in itself. Very cool indeed. Now the second channel is where all the Mesa Mark magic is at for most people. We've got the Mark II C+ mode, which is cool. We've got the Mark IV mode, and we've got the Extreme mode, which is the favorite mode on this channel for me personally. The Mark II C+ mode is cool, but it's really tight and the bottom end isn't as huge as I was expecting from listening to bands like Dream Theater and Metallica. So this mode perhaps is better for lead stuff or more crunchy stuff. I have gotten some great and huge tones out of it, but it just doesn't work well with every guitar and IR. The Mark IV mode seems to have more gain and harmonics going on, so that's more of a high gain mode than the Mark II C+ mode. A very cool sounding mode. But like I said, the extreme mode is where the magic is at for me. It seems to have the most gain and the most low end, so the most sort of bigness to it. Even if you dial it in to sound quite tight by lowering the bass control and stuff like that, it just sounds the biggest. And I think I remember from reading the manual that the extreme mode was based on certain settings on the Mark IV. So it does sound like a classic Mark amp with the extreme mode, but it's just easier to dial in to sound great for metal and other high gain genres. And the 35 is very similar to the Mark V 25, which is a smaller version of the same amp. The 35 watt version has 4 EL84s in the power section, and the 25 watt version only has 2. The 35 watt version also has the solo master controls on the side there, which can be handy for boosting the levels for solos and stuff. And I think it also has bigger transformers, so it will sound more solid at higher levels. If you just want to play at home or record yourself with those classic Mesa Mark tones, perhaps the 25 watt version will be enough for you. But if you want to use your amp at higher levels, perhaps the 35 watt version is better for you since it can go louder and will have more power. So a great amp overall, but it was pretty hard to dial in when I just got it, so keep that in mind as well. It's a tweaker's amp for sure. The next amp in my collection is the Marshall DSL-20HR. A very cool little amplifier, probably the most affordable amp in my entire collection. I traded in my orange Dark Terror for this Marshall. I didn't really like the orange Dark Terror that much. It was very scooped and fizzy sounding to my ears, but the Marshall DSL-20HR is a very cool amplifier indeed. Sure, it's made in Asia, it's affordable, but it just has a very cool and characteristic sound that really slices through the mix. So it's a very bright amplifier with bright clean tones and very soaring high gain tone. Plenty of bite and gain there. So it's not my best Marshall amplifier for those classic mid-gain crunch tones like the Marshall JCM 800 Studio or the Mini Plexi, but it's great for more modern mid or high gain tones or very sparkly cleans. I like the addition of the resonance control, which is quite handy for sort of fine-tuning the low end, although it's not as powerful as other resonance controls on other amps, but nonetheless pretty handy to have. I'm not really a fan of the tone shift knob that I also have on my DSL-50. It sort of scoops the amplifier, but it scoops it way too much for my taste. Because mids are good, people. Mids are good for the mix. So it's a cool little amplifier if you're looking for a Marshall amp that's affordable and has a good high gain tone and a decent clean tone. Check the amplifier out for sure. It's cheap, it's small, it's light, but it still has EL34s in the power section, just as all the other 20 watt Marshalls. So that's also a very cool feature. But just keep in mind that it's a pretty bright amplifier that will slice through any mix. The next amp in my collection is my EVH 5153 50 watt EL34, which is up there. A very cool amplifier indeed. It was one of the first amps that I purchased in my collection actually. So it's a 50 watt amplifier, so it's plenty loud and it sounds absolutely huge. Especially the red channel has that classic EVH sound, great for metal. A lot of gain, a lot of tightness and aggressiveness, but still with a huge sounding low end. And the resonance control on the back really helps to dial that in. The blue channel on this amplifier definitely is underrated. People don't seem to like it because it's not as tight and aggressive, blah blah blah. But I think that it adds another flavor to the amplifier that the red channel does not have to offer. It basically sounds more vintage than the red channel. It has more of a sound that reminds me of something like a Soldano. So to me, the blue channel is a very cool addition to this amplifier, and it makes it that much more versatile, especially for in the studio. The green channel or the clean channel is kind of nice, but it's very, very clean and it has a lot of headroom. And I tend to like clean channels that break up a little bit easier because I prefer the sound of clean channels with a bit more sort of subtle saturation or compression, so to speak. But this clean channel is just squeaky, squeaky clean. So that's just something to keep in mind. Not everyone is a fan of those types of clean tones. So yeah, overall a great sounding amplifier, plenty of gain and plenty of tonal options. I love it. Next up is the WONG's HD15 amplifier, which is up here. This is also a kind of recent addition to my collection. It's an amp that was built in China but with a lot of love and care in their custom shop. So the build and sound quality is high, but it's very affordable. I've already done an extensive review and demo of this amplifier on the channel, so if you're interested in a more in-depth look on this amplifier, definitely check that out. The clean tones on this amp are great. Very sparkly and chimey. As far as I know, the clean or crunch channel is based on a Bogner Shiva. You can also use the crunch switch on this channel to push it up to a very nice British crunch. I love options like these. It just makes the amps that much more versatile. There's also a bright switch, but in my opinion it makes the amp sound way too bright for my guitars and my taste. And then of course the overdrive channel on this amplifier is very cool. That was based on a Soldano if I'm correct. It has that very gooey and organic tubey saturation going on. A very cool sound indeed and very unique to my collection. There's no other amp in this collection that sounds like the WONG, so I'm looking very much forward to trying more WONG's amps in the future. The next amp in my collection is my Angle Fireball 25. Also a quite recent addition to my collection, a quite new amplifier. They've only been making these amps for about a year or so. It's a smaller version of the big Angle Fireball 100, which I also have. So it's obviously smaller and it has a lower wattage, but it does have two 6L6 tubes in the power section. And this amp and the PRS MT15 are the only small amps in my collection that have 6L6 tubes in the power section. So those amps are small, but they still have a very big sound. I still have to do a comparison between the Fireball 25 and the Fireball 100, which I will get to one day, I promise. But I can tell you now that the Fireball 25 does have a bit of a different tone than the Fireball 100. The Fireball 100 seems to have a lot more gain on tap, for example. And the distortion character is just a little bit different. But it does sound great, it's small, the clean tones are nice, you can push the clean channel up to a very nice crunch. And the high gain tones are just very nice, a very classic angle, with a lot of gain, clarity and articulation. It also has some nice features like a built-in power soak and stuff like that. And of course the built-in noise gate, which is a very, very handy feature. More high gain amps should have a built-in noise gate for sure. So yeah, stay tuned for a comparison between the Angle Fireball 25 and the Fireball 100. And of course the Fireball 25 and the PRS MT15. Should be fun. The next amp in my collection that we're going to talk about is my Blackstar HD Club 50 Mark II, which is over here on the floor. This is the newest amplifier in my collection. I recently did a full demo review of the amp on my channel, so do check that out if you're interested. It's a very cool amplifier with a lot of tonal options that makes it very versatile. The clean channel is cool. It has two voicings, so you can have a sort of nice British clean tone like a Vox, or a kind of Fendery clean tone, so a bit more scooped and sparkly sounding. And just as the orange Rockefeller and TH30, it only has a treble and bass control and a volume control for the clean channel. But that gives you more than enough options to get a great clean tone. The reverb on this amp is also quite cool. It has a sort of voicing switch on the back for a dark or light setting, so you can even tweak the sound of the reverb. And of course the overdrive channel in the amp is very nice as well. You can get a more classic or organic sounding British drive tone, or a more modern sort of boosted high gain tone with a bit more tightness and a more aggressiveness. And the ISF control on that channel is also very nice to really dial in the amp to sound to your liking. So it's a 50 watt amplifier with two EL34s in the power section, plenty of power there. It's quite affordable too, and it has a lot of tonal options, so it's a very nice amp indeed. I'm definitely looking forward to using that amp more in future videos, so stay tuned for that. I want to do a video where I compare it to a Laney, a Hughes and Kettner, and the Orange TH30, so those are all amps in the same price range. So that should be interesting and fun. Definitely let me know if you're interested in seeing that video on the channel soon. The next amp in my collection is the Orange OR15. It's a cute little orange amplifier, and it's the only small orange that I have with the orange head shell. So it's only 15 watts, it's small and compact, but still with that classic orange look. It's only a one channel amp, so it has a very simple layout, gain, volume, and a 3-band EQ. You can set it to 15 watts or 7 watts, I believe. So that's a cool function to have for playing at home or for practice. This amp really has that classic orange sound, that fuzzy orange sound that we all love, right? I guess it's loosely based on the orange Rockefeller, but to me it has a bit more of a vintage tone, so a bit more scoop sort of, less mid-range bark, but you can dial this amp to sound great for clean tones, crunch tones, or high gain tones, because there's plenty of gain on tap. So I guess this amp is quite versatile despite being so simple. Just 2 EL84s in the power section, so maybe not enough juice for a live gig, but for recording or in the studio or playing at home, it's just a wonderful amplifier. So if you're looking for a small orange amp but with that classic orange tone, definitely check out the OR15. The next amp in my collection that we're going to talk about is the WONG & Kettner Meister Deluxe 40, which is over here. This is also a quite recent addition to my collection. It's a very cool amplifier by a very cool brand. It has that classic blue WONG & Kettner look, so it looks very unique and it looks very cool in a dark room. And if you compare this amp to the Grandmeister Deluxe 40, which we'll get to in a minute, you'll see that this amp is much more simple and basic. Just a 3-channel amplifier without all the bells and whistles, but with some great tones in it. I already did a very extensive review and demo of this amp on my channel, so if you're interested in a more in-depth look on the amp, definitely check that out as well. So we've got a very nice and versatile clean channel that can be pushed up to a very nice mild overdrive. The crunch channel is very cool as well. It can conjure some nice British crunch tones. And the EQ between the crunch and lead channels is shared, so that's also something to keep in mind. This amp has no resonance or presence controls, no reverb and stuff, so only basic EQ controls and gain controls and volume controls for each channel. And the high gain tones from the lead channel on this amp are actually very cool. They kind of remind me of the sound of a dual rectifier, so it has that scooped American sound, but perhaps the Tubemeister is a bit more articulate and defined than a rectifier. So a bit more tight and a bit more mix ready, so to speak. So this amp is 40 watts and it has 4 EL84s in the power section. It's still very compact, so it's very easy to transport to your gigs, and I think that it will do great on stage with its 40 watts. I think with 4 EL84s in general, you've got plenty of power to do a gig, in my opinion. So I love WONG & Kettner amps in general. I think they work great in a mix and they have a lot of tonal options, which is cool. Next up, let's talk about my Marshall JVM 410H, which is over there. So this is the modern Marshall flagship amplifier, the one with all the knobs. Way too many knobs for some people, but I love the tonal options that this beast has to offer. I mean, we've got a resonance, a presence control, 2 independent master volumes, we've got reverb, and we've got 4 channels, and those 4 channels have 3 modes each. So that's 12 different modes total. So this amp basically has 12 amplifiers built in one. And all those modes really sound good. I mean, the cleans are great, the crunch tones are great and classic, and the high gain tones are very awesome too. There's basically nothing that this amplifier can't do. It's a 100 watt amplifier with 4 EL34s in the power section, so it's quite powerful and quite versatile. So yeah, nothing but love for my Marshall JVM 410H, a very cool amplifier that I hope to use a lot in my future videos. And it's probably the only Marshall in my collection that is very good at modern high gain tones without a boost. So a great Marshall for everything from clean tones all the way up to high gain tones. The next amp in the collection is my PV6505, which I have over here. It's the 120 watt version with the 4 6L6 tubes in the power section. It's very well built, it's reliable, it's very loud and powerful. It was built in China and the build quality is great. It's a very reliable amp, it's very solid and it sounds absolutely huge. Of course it has that classic old 5150 or 6505 sound. The cleans are alright, a little bit honky perhaps, but the crunch tones and the high gain tones are just to die for. These amps have such a big and solid sound, they really hold their own in a mix. Very chunky and tight, but not as tight as something like an EVH, but obviously an amazing amp for high gain tones and also crunch tones. So yeah, for super ballsy high gain metal and rock tones, this is a great choice. Not the most versatile amplifier in my collection, so I only grab this amplifier if I need that sound, but it does that sound very well indeed. I'm going to be doing a very extensive comparison between the PV6505, the Mesa dual rectifier, the Marshall JVM 410H, and the orange Rockefeller 50. So that's going to be very fun and interesting indeed. Stay tuned for that. The next amp in my collection, which is somewhere up there, is my orange Tiny Terror. I got this one on the used market for only like 250 euros or something. I already owned the Dual Terror before that, but I really felt that I needed the OG Tiny Terror in my collection. And I gotta tell you, this amp is amazing. It's very simple, only 3 controls, a gain, a volume, and a tone control. And you can switch up the wattage a little bit, so it does 15 and 7 watts, I believe. But it has such a big tone. It does have that classic orange tone, but more in a sort of vintage Marshallese style. It does have a great reputation, of course. I mean, everybody knows the Tiny Terror, but that's for a good reason. And the tones that this little amp has to offer are absolutely great. The clean tones are nice, the crunch tones are really, really good, and the high gain tones are quite nice too. Probably not the most metal sounding amplifier, but pretty amazing for mid to high gain rock. Really nice. Classic orange tone, but with a bit more bark than something like the OR15, for example. The Tiny Terror really is something that you have to experience for yourself. 2 EL84s in the power section, so not super loud, but plenty loud for a small stage or for practicing or using it in the studio. And it just looks so cool and it's so tiny. It's kind of a shame that they don't make this amp anymore, but you can find plenty of them on the used market if you're interested in getting one. So overall, a very cool amplifier. It looks cool, it sounds amazing. What's not to love, basically? When you compare the tone of the Tiny Terror to some of the other orange amps, I think that this one has a bit more of a raw sound. So it really has a nice way of cutting through the mix. Nice and punchy and kind of nasty in a good way. Love the Tiny Terror. Everybody needs a Tiny Terror in my opinion. The next amp in my collection is my Mesobugi dual rectifier solo head. It's the 3-channel one from the 2000s, so the non-multi-watt 3-channel one. I think the previous owner painted it black, so it's the blacked out version. It looks really cool and mean. I think the rectifier is basically one of my favorite amplifiers of all time. I'm just a huge fan of the Mesa rectifier in general, as a lot of my favorite guitarists have been using those amps over the years. Bands like Metallica, Dream Theater, and all sorts of cool nu metal bands that I really enjoy. So it's an amplifier that I love a lot, and it really does that classic Mesa rectifier tone. In fact, there is no other amp that can really replicate that sound, in my opinion. It's got that really big and fuzzy and ballsy but sort of loose sounding high gain tone, but it sounds absolutely huge in a mix. So for that typical raw and scooped Recto sound, there's no other amp in my collection that really beats the dual rectifier. The clean tones are quite nice, the crunch tones are okay but not amazing. They don't have that mid-range bark like a Marshall, for example. But like I said, the high gain tones are awesome, especially the red channel on the modern mode. A lot has been said about these amplifiers in the past, so I'm not sure what I can really add to that. Whether you love it or hate it, that signature rectifier sound is just a sound that you can't deny. So yeah, I love my dual rectifier and I hope it never breaks down because it sounds so awesome and so authentic. Of course, this is the 100-watt version, so it's got 4 6L6 tubes in the power section, and it has 2 of those rectifier tubes that I also like to use because they add that nice sort of typical rectifier compression to the sound, which I really love. Alright, so that's all for the rectifier. The next amp in my collection is my Laney IRT 60H, or the Ironheart 60 head, which is over here behind me in the cupboard. And it actually is a really nice amp. Over here it's quite affordable, somewhere in between 600 and 700 euros. It's made in Asia, and I've got the 60-watt version with the 2 6L6 tubes in the power section. But this amp is surprisingly versatile and it sounds great in a mix. It's got 3 channels, it has a built-in boost, has built-in reverb and a sort of attenuator function. And you can really fine-tune the sound of the amplifier to your liking, which is really cool because it has these push-pull functions for the EQ controls. I really like stuff like that to really dial in the sound that works for you. And for the super high gain tones, I really like to engage the onboard boost just to increase the gain a bit. And overall, this amplifier sort of has a classic British tone, but it's not as mid-range barky as something like a Marshall, so it sits somewhere in between something like a Mesa or a Peavey and that classic Marshall tone, so somewhere in between there. The clean tones are gorgeous and the crunch tones are very cool as well, with that sort of characteristic Laney sound that I love. It sounds kind of raw and punchy. And the high gain zones are very awesome indeed, very unique sounding, but it sounds absolutely huge in a mix and very balanced as well. The amp also looks really cool with the red lights in it, and yeah, it has a really unique look overall. It has some cool extra bells and whistles like a DI out and stuff like that, but I just love the tones that it has to offer and the tonal shaping options. So very different to something like a Tiny Terror, for example, which only has 3 controls. So it's a very unique amplifier that absolutely has its place in my collection, and I want to use it a lot more in future videos. Next up is my Marshall SC20H, or the JCM 800 Studio. So this is another one of those smaller Marshall heads, 20 watts, 2 EL34s in the power section, compact, lightweight, but it really has a great sound to it. To my ears, it really does that classic JCM 800 tone very well. So it's absolutely great for mid-gain rock, you know, like Guns N' Roses and AC/DC, those sort of styles, but the clean tones are also very nice as well. When you compare this amp to other Marshalls in my collection, it has that classic JCM 800 bite to it. So that upper mid-range cut that really works well in a mix. And it sounds absolutely amazing with a Les Paul, for example. For clean tones, I like to use the low sensitivity input. It really stays clean very nicely with that, and it sounds great with single coil guitars as well, especially on the neck pickup. But for mid-gain tones, the high sensitivity input is awesome, of course. I like to crank the gain up quite a bit and the master volume as well to find that sweet spot where the power tubes begin to saturate. So it's obviously not the most versatile amp in my collection, but it does that classic Marshall JCM 800 tone so well. I highly recommend this amp to you if you're looking for that classic tone, but in a smaller package with less volume. A very cool amp, definitely one of my favorite 20 watt Marshalls. The next amp in the collection is my PRS MT15 Mark Tremonti head. This is that famous small 15 watt amp by PRS that a lot of us know and a lot of us love. And as I said earlier, just as the Fireball 25, this one also has 2 6L6 tubes in the power section. So the clean channel is great for finger picking and stuff. It's kind of similar to the EVH because it's very squeaky clean. It has a lot of headroom. So it's not very easy to get this channel to break up, which is kind of a shame for my taste. But other than that, it sounds very solid and fine. Kind of like a Fender clean tone sort of. And the high gain tones on this amp are very cool. It sounds somewhere in between something like a dual rectifier and a PV6505. I would say it sounds more like a PV6505 than a rectifier though, because the MT15 has a lot more mids than a rectifier. Rectifiers tend to sound very scooped, and the MT15 has plenty of mids to help it cut through the mix. So it has a very solid and ballsy sound overall. It definitely sounds like a bigger amp, but in a smaller package. Now this is not the best amp for classic rock tones or something like that. It's not really good at replicating that classic Marshall or British tone. Sure, you can get some crunch tones out of it by dialing down the gain on the drive channel, but don't expect this amp to sound close to a JCM 800, for example. So if you're a rock or metal player that needs some good high gain tones and some nice clean tones, definitely check this amp out. They're not expensive too, so they won't break the bank. So yeah, enough said about this amp. Let's move on to the next amp. The next amplifier in my collection is my orange Rocker 15 Terror, which is up there somewhere. A very nice amplifier. When you compare this orange amp to other orange amps in my collection, this one has more of a vintage tone to it. Sure, it can do some high gain tones, but it will never sound as aggressive and punchy as the Rockeverb. This one was meant more for low to mid gain tones in my opinion. It has a very nice and characteristic fat saturation. It's very warm and round. Definitely not as raw sounding as my Tiny Terror, for example, but very nice gain characteristics indeed. Now the gain channel has that classic gooey orange tone with a lot of harmonics and saturation, but the clean channel or the natural channel is also very nice. It's a very nicely balanced channel with only one control, a volume control, but that channel tends to work so well with drive and preamp pedals that it's a great pedal platform. Now it's only 15 watts, so just as the other small orange amps, it only has 2 EL84s in the power section, so not a lot of power, probably not enough for gigs, but certainly great for home use, practice, recording, and that sort of stuff. And since it has 2 channels, it's actually quite versatile indeed. And it just looks really cool too. So if you're looking for an orange amp with that classic orange tone, but not too high gain and more geared towards the low to mid gain player, definitely check out this amp. Next up is my Angle Fireball 100 that I have over here. What a beast of an amp this is. This really is a 100-watt powerhouse with 4 6L6 tubes in the power section. Just as the small Fireball 25, it has great sparkly, chimey clean tones. You can push that channel up to a very nice overdrive as well, just as the small one. And the high gain tones are absolutely amazing. Quite raw and tight and aggressive sounding, but with a very ballsy and thick low end. And the amp, of course, also has that built-in noise gate just as a small one, so that's very, very convenient indeed. With this amp, you simply don't need to use a noise gate pedal in front or in the loop or something like that, because it's very silent and you never have any troubles with hiss or annoying hum or stuff like that. It does have a very unique sound that tends to work very well with metal, but I think that it's a great all-round head that can do anything from great sparkly cleans all the way up to super high gain and everything in between, but it does this with its own sort of unique tonal characteristics. Killer amps with a lot of tone and plenty of tonal functions to get some great tones out of it. Really love the Angle Fireball 100 and I really should use it more often in videos. Next up is my WONG Kettner Grandmeister Deluxe 40, which is back here somewhere in the closet. It's quite similar to the Tubemeister Deluxe that we talked about. Also 40 watts with 4 EL84s in the power section, but this one is jam-packed with extra features. This thing has 4 channels, a clean, a crunch, a lead and an ultra channel, and all of those channels have an individually voiced boost on them as well. So that alone makes the amp that much more versatile. And the amp also has a bunch of effects like delay, reverb and modulation that you can all program in via MIDI. You can store all the presets. You've got the red box DI out for direct recording. You've got silent recording as well. You've got a resonance control. You've got a presence control. All sorts of options to make this amp sound the way that you want it. But it does this with that very defined and sort of hi-fi sounding WONG Kettner tone. And what I really like about the sound of the amp is how clear it sits in the mix. It always cuts through very nicely without sounding harsh. So very chunky and clear on the high gain tones. Very nice crunch tones and very nice clean tones as well. And like the Tubemeister Deluxe 40, it's quite compact, but it's still quite loud with its 40 watts. So a great portable all-in-one gigging solution. And of course it just looks very neat as well with those blue LED lights. So I really love the Grandmeister Deluxe 40. It's just one of those amps that really does it all and it does it very well. Next in line is my Marshall JCM 2000 DSL 50, which is in the cupboard over here. I bought this amp used from a guitar store about 2 years ago or so for about 500 euros. And it's a very cool and unique sounding Marshall amplifier. It's quite versatile as well. We've got 2 channels but 2 voices per channel. So the first channel has a very nice but bright clean tone and a very cool classic crunch tone as well, just great sounding. But the ultra gain channel on this amp is also very cool. It's high gain, sure, and it sounds very huge, but it's not as tight and articulate as something like an EVH or an Angle, for example. So it sort of has that fluffy tone with a softer low-end response on the palm mutes, for example. But I really enjoy that for a rock mix. But with a good boost up front, you can really push this amp up to a very nice metal crunch. They don't make these anymore. This one was made in the UK still, and all the newer DSLs are made in Asia. But yeah, overall a very cool amplifier, and it has been very reliable so far. So this is the 50 watt version with 2 EL34s in the power section. Great sounding amplifier overall. Next up is my orange TH30 head, which I have over here. This is also a recent addition to my collection. I had 6 of those smaller orange heads for quite a while, and I felt like I needed to get one of the bigger ones because they look so cool and they sound great. And I was really pleasantly surprised with the sound of this amplifier. The layout on the amp is very simple, just a clean channel and a drive channel with 3 controls each. The clean tones are gorgeous, very great clean tones, and the drive tones are very nice as well. Plenty of gain on tap. The dirty channel sounds kind of similar to the Dark Terror, but with more mid, so it sounds much better in a mix in my opinion. So it's a 30 watt amplifier with 4 EL84s in the power section, so it's quite powerful and plenty loud for gigs in my opinion. But it's also great for home use, practice or recording or stuff like that. Now this amp does not have that mid-range cut or punch that the Rockefeller 50 has, since this one is a bit more fizzy and sort of scooped sounding, but it's still a great sounding amplifier that will do anything well. I'm still planning on comparing this amp to my Rockefeller 50, and that will be very interesting indeed, so stay tuned for that. And this one is built in Asia, so it's more affordable than the Rockefeller as well. So if you're looking for one of those big orange heads but with a better price tag, definitely check out the TH30. Especially if you're into high gain tones, because this is not the best orange for sort of mid-gain classic rock tones, in my opinion. Then we have the little PV6505MH, or the 6505 mini head, which I have somewhere back here. This is the small version of the PV6505. It's a 20 watt amplifier with 2 EL84s in the power section, so it's compact, it's small, and it's quite portable, but it sounds really, really good. This model has been around for a bunch of years, but it still holds up really well when you compare it to the other smaller amps in my collection. The clean tones are quite decent actually, and the crunch tones are great, and the high gain tones are just really, really nice. So sure, this amp is small and it has a low wattage rating. It's not as loud and big as the big 6505, but with that in mind, I think it really does a great job of replicating that 6505 tone that we all know and love. It probably won't be loud enough for use on stage or something like that, but it's a great amplifier for recording or practice or playing at home and stuff like that. So for example, if you're a metal player that just wants one solid tube amp for in the studio, this could be a great option indeed. Yeah, cool little amplifier overall. Love my PV6505MH. I would love to try the PV Invective MH as well, but yeah, they're kind of hard to get at the moment. Next up is my Laney IRT Studio amp, which is back here somewhere. This is the 15 watt rack mountable version of the Ironheart. And it has all the same tonal shaping options and features as the big Ironheart 60 head, which I just talked about. So it also has that built-in boost, 3 channels, the push-pull EQ, features like the built-in reverb and stuff like the direct out recording and stuff like that. And this one is 15 watts, it has 2 EL84s in the power section. It's quite compact because it's a rack mountable head, so it's not like a standard lunchbox size amp. But very versatile and great sounding indeed, and I think it sounds very close to the big one. It could very well be that the preamp sections are identical in these two amps, it's just that the power sections obviously are different. So with its 15 watts it will never be as loud as the 60 watt version or the 120 watt version for that matter, but it's still a great amp for home use or practice or recording. A very cool amplifier indeed. Next up is my Marshall SV20H, which I have over here, which is basically the mini plexi. This amp is also very cool and unique when you compare it to other amps in my collection. It's not a great amp for high gain tones at all, but it's amazing for clean, crunch and mid gain tones. It just really has that classic Marshall plexi tone, but in a smaller package and with less headroom. And the less headroom thing is quite of an advantage for me personally, because I'm not going to crank up a 100 watt plexi in this apartment. That would just be insane. And even this 20 watt version is insanely loud. I mean, it's super loud, but luckily with my load box setup and with the IRs, I can dial it in to sound pretty awesome without disturbing the neighbors. I guess you're all familiar with that classic Marshall plexi design. You can jumper the channels and stuff like that to give it more tonal versatility and more gain. So it's a great amp for classic rock for tones like Jimmy Page, you know, and early Iron Maiden, AC/DC, stuff like that. Sounds amazing with my Les Paul as well. So yeah, if you're looking for that vintage and classic Marshall tone, definitely check out the SV20H. Very cool amp indeed. Next up is my orange Dual Terror, which I have over here. Now Now this is the 30 watt version of the Tiny Terror basically, with the additional fat channel. So it does that Tiny Terror sound, but the fat channel adds some more versatility to the tonal options of this amp. The fat channel has its own characteristics. It's a bit smoother sounding and a bit more mid-focused, whereas the Tiny Terror channel is a bit more raw and sort of in-your-face sounding. I really love this amp for anything from clean tones all the way up to hard rock and everything in between. Sure, it can do metal as well, especially with a boost, but it's just a great sounding rock amplifier. Great for classic rock and hard rock, and the gain of this amp just sounds so thick and juicy, so characteristic for Orange. And of course, extra headroom when you compare it to the Tiny Terror. Of course, this one is 30 watts with 4 EL84s in the power section, so that's plenty loud for on stage as well. So a very simple amp with 2 channels and only 6 controls in total, but it has a very, very nice tone. I really love this amp. Next up is the WONG Kettner Black Spirit 200 amplifier. This is the only amp in my collection that does not have tubes in it, so it's a solid state amplifier. And it basically has all the same features as the Grandmeister Deluxe 40, with the effects and the MIDI programming and all that stuff, like the presets and the reverb and the modulation and the delay and the boost and the 4 channels. All that good stuff, but it's much more portable and lightweight because of the solid state technology inside of it. And it aims to replicate the sound of a tube amplifier. Now, it definitely has its own sound to it, so it does not sound exactly like a tube amplifier, but that unique second control really helps to give it that characteristic tube compression that you get when you crank up your tube amps. So I think that it's a great sounding solid state amplifier that comes very close to the sound of an actual tube amp. So if you're looking for something that doesn't break easily, that is compact and lightweight but does a lot, definitely check out the WONG Kettner Black Spirit 200. A very cool amplifier indeed. Then we have the EVH 5153 LBX head, which is over here. This is the first version of that amplifier. It's 15 watts with 2 EL84s in the power section, so it's not super loud, but it's very compact. The shape and size is similar to something like the Tiny Terror, so it has that classic lunchbox amplifier size, and it only has 2 channels, so it has the blue channel and the red channel, so no clean channel on this one, no green channel. The blue channel is cool for classic rock and the red channel is great for metal. Both of the channels are punchy and tight, but because of that signature EVH tone that the amp has, it's not super versatile. That classic EVH tone just is very sort of articulate and outspoken, but it doesn't give a lot of room for tonal shaping, so it sort of is what it is really. The resonance control on the back really helps to give it a little bit more low end, but it will never sound as huge as something like the 50 watt version of the EVH 5153. So this amp is better suited for playing at home, recording, or in the studio. I would not recommend using this amp on stage, especially if you need some good clean tones as well. Anyway, great sounding lunchbox EVH amplifier with that EVH sound, but just not super versatile because of the lack of a proper clean channel. Next up is the Mesobugi Mini Rectifier 25. This is of course the miniature version of my dual rectifier. This one is only 25 watts and it has 2 EL84s in the power section, just as a lot of the other lunchbox amps in my collection. It does a great job of sort of emulating that big rectifier tone, but in a much smaller package. Obviously this amp has a lot less headroom than the 100 watt version, so it's probably not the best rectifier for use on stage, but it's just great for in the studio or for playing at home or for practice. I really love recording this amplifier because it really does have that classic Recto tone. You know, it sounds scooped, it sounds ballsy, it sounds in your face and raw, just as how you want a rectifier to sound. And the clean and crunch tones are actually quite nice on this thing. I've used this amp in plenty of videos on my channel, so do check those out if you're interested in more. But you'll definitely be seeing more of this little amp on my channel in the future. Love the mini rectifier. Next up we have the Marshall 2525H, or the Mini Jubilee, which I have all the way up there. I've got a sort of limited edition version with the split vinyl look, so it looks a little bit different than the regular version of the Mini Jubilee, but it sounds exactly the same. This is one of the more versatile 20 watt Marshall studio heads. It has a bit more tonal shaping options because it has 2 channels. And you can also pull that rhythm clip thing to make it sound a bit more tight and aggressive. The clean tones on this amp are quite nice, and the crunch tones are quite great as well. And this amp has quite a bit more gain than my JCM 800 Studio or the SC20H. So this amp has a wider range of tones than the SC20H and the SV20H in my opinion. But it does have a unique tonal flavor. It has a more of a rounder and softer sound and feel to it than something like the SC20H, which has a very prominent upper mid-range cut. And this one sounds a bit more gentle in general, but it's more versatile because of the tonal shaping options. So it's a very cool Marshall option in the 20 watt range that I definitely recommend checking out if you're looking for a compact Marshall with plenty of tonal options. Then we have the orange Gym Root Terror, which I have over here. This is another one of those small, compact 15 watt orange amps, very cool indeed. Also 2 EL84s in the power section, just as the Tiny Terror for example. And this one is basically a miniature Rockefeller, or the dirty channel of the Rockefeller. And this is the signature amp for the guitarist of Slipknot, Jim Root, a very cool guitarist. And yeah, it's a very nice amplifier, very cool indeed. It sounds kind of similar to the Rockefeller, but not exactly the same. But this one was also based on one of the earlier versions of the Rockefeller, if I'm correct. Probably the Mark 1 or 2, not sure. But yeah, just a simple design, a one-channel amp, just as the OR15, volume and gain control, and a 3-band EQ. It can do cleans, it can also do crunch tones, but the high gain tones are very nice. This is probably the one mini orange amp that is the best suited for modern rock and metal styles. It looks cool, it sounds amazing, what's not to love? I love the orange Gym Root Terror. They don't make them anymore unfortunately, but you can still get them used for a great price. Around 300 euros is what they go for around here. And don't let the name fool you, they don't just do metal. They're just great all-round rock amps with that classic signature orange tone. Next up is the Angle Iron Ball. Also a very cool and compact amplifier. Again, just a 20 watt amplifier with 2 EL84s in the power section. Built in Germany, so very solid and reliable. It looks really cool and it sounds awesome. The clean tones are very nice and pristine and quite chimey and bright. And just as the other Angle amps, you can push the clean channel up to a very nice British crunch. And the high gain tones are very tight, aggressive and gnarly sounding, but with a big bottom end underneath. So quite versatile indeed, but mostly geared towards the metal player, in my opinion. I still also need to compare this amplifier to the Angle Fireball 25. It should be interesting to hear the difference between the 6L6 power section and the EL84 power section. I think the preamps sound quite similar. They both have that tight and gnarly Angle sound, but it remains to be seen how they compare directly in recording settings, so stay tuned for that. And then we have my Marshall JMP1 preamp, which I have over here. Of course they don't make these anymore, but I really love this amplifier. I got this thing used for about 250 euros. Since this has no power amp in it, I like to run it through the power amp of my DSL-50, which sounds great. These preamps are used by bands like Iron Maiden and Deftones, and they just have a really solid tone to them that really sounds great in a mix. Plenty of mids, plenty of chunk, and pretty tight sounding as well. The clean tones and the crunch tones are nice, but I really love the high gain tones that this classic sounding amplifier has to offer. I don't have a Friedman amp myself, but I think that it kind of reminds me of how I think a Friedman sounds. It does make sense because those Friedman amps are kind of based on that hot-rodded Marshall tone that we all know and love from the 80s and 90s. But yeah, the Marshall JMP1, great classic sounding preamp, great for anything from clean tones to 80s rock to hard rock to modern rock and metal, so quite versatile indeed. I love mine and I'm glad to have one in my collection. And now for the final amplifier in my collection, the orange Brent Heinz Terror. In case you don't know, Brent Heinz is the guitarist for Mastodon, a very cool band indeed. And that band is known for its very unique style, quite heavy and progressive. So maybe you would expect a very high gain amp from that guitarist. But in fact, this amp does not sound very modern and high gain at all. It sounds more like a pissed off modded Plexi or something. Very interesting indeed. It makes sense though, because Brent Heinz is known for using classic Marshall amps and stuff like that on stage. But it was just pretty interesting to me when I plugged it in for the first time. I was like, whoa, this thing sounds unique, especially when you compare it to the Rocker 15 Terror, which looks very similar. So it looks very similar to that amp, but it does not sound the same at all. The Brent Heinz Terror has a much more raw sound, much more bright and in your face. So yeah, very cool and unique indeed, and they don't make them anymore. So if you're interested in this tone and you're looking for this amp, definitely check them out on the used market. Very cool and unique, and a nice amp to round off my collection. Alright folks, that's all for this video. Thanks for sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed this journey into the world of my amp collection. Please drop a comment down below, and don't forget to hit subscribe along with the bell to stay up to date on all of my activities. And you can also follow Sonic Drive Studio on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!